and together with the president, you have first John F. Kennedy, and then particularly during the Lyndon Johnson presidency, you have this real energy that is present that promotes an effort to enact legislation that will promote racial equality. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let's jump into a discussion. I'm just going to tick off a few important pieces of legislation that are passed by 1957. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which established the Civil Rights Commission. The Civil Rights Commission was given the responsibility for investigating claims of racial bias. Okay. So we have a new agency of the federal government that's created in the late 1950s and is given the responsibility to investigate claims of racial bias. And then in 1960, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act that was intended to stop southern states from denying voting rights of African Americans. And while both of these acts were very important symbolically, 57 and 1960 Civil Rights Act were important symbolically, they really lacked teeth in that there was no enforcement mechanism. In other words, what I'm saying here is that the Civil Rights Commission could investigate claims of racial bias, but it really didn't have the authority to do anything about racial bias when it found racial bias. Okay? And all of that changed in a big way with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It is hard for me to overstate this, to exaggerate the significance of this legislation. This is one of the most important acts, not just in the area of civil rights, but I think any area of legislation that has been enacted by the United States Congress in its history. The 1964 Civil Rights Act did a number of things. It generally, we can say that it prohibited discrimination not only by government institutions, but also by private citizens in 4 areas. Okay? 4 areas: voter registration, public accommodations, public schools, and employment. Now we're going to come back to number 2, so put a pin in that one. We're going to come back to that here in just a second. I just want to say a few words here about number 4, okay? Consistent with the intent of ending racial discrimination in employment practices, the legislation also created an agency called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Maybe some of you have heard of that, the EEOC. Okay? And the following year, in 1965, President Johnson signed an executive order. Don't worry, I'm going to go back to the previous slide. President Johnson signed an executive order which authorized the EEOC to begin implementing affirmative action programs. Right? So this is really the origins of affirmative action in federal hiring and federal contracting and beyond. Okay? So even if we just stop the discussion of the 1964 Civil Rights Act right there, just that would be enough to say that's one of the most significant pieces of legislation ever passed by Congress. And unfortunately, I wish we had more time to talk about it because there's lots of fertile ground there for us to talk about the implications of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and affirmative action programs in the area of employment practices and so on, as well as university admissions and all that sort of stuff where affirmative action applies. But unfortunately, we just don't have that kind of time. So we're going to return back to that second item